Thank you very much. I'm really pleased they've taken her picture off the screen because you'll all agree that she's much more attractive than me. She got all her looks from her mother, not me. I'm really sorry that it's me instead of Max. You're all supposed to go, oh. I'll say it again. I'm really sorry that it's me instead of Max. But I promise to keep it short. Hooray, come on. That's what you're supposed to say. Yeah, sure. See how we go. One of the interesting things about epidemiological research is the way in which the data is interpreted. Max quoted the New Zealand Institute, which is a right-wing think tank in New Zealand. And if Max was here, he would show you a lot of data that was in direct contradiction from the graphs that Max showed you. And that is a real problem with this sort of research. When you combined with the fact that Gareth Morgan told me that economics is not a science, it's an art form. It's the way in which you interpret the facts. And when facts are capable of being interpreted in a very wide range of ways, that leads to very different conclusions. My view, and when I talk to people, firstly, that income inequality has increased significantly from the 80s. It increased very rapidly from the 80s through to about the end of the 90s. And then it's been largely stable since then. But the major point is that income inequality is much greater now than it was, say, in the early 80s. And governments over the last 15 years have done very little to reduce income inequality in this country. The second point is that I think it is now well established that there is a causal link between inequality, between increasing inequality and increasing social ills, an increasing lack of cohesiveness in society, and it is also damaging for the economy. Janet Yellen, who is now Secretary for the Treasury in the United States, her thesis, in fact, was on the relationship between inequality and the economy, and she showed very clearly that, in fact, it is damaging. Second point is that when I talk to people about what's happening to society and I explain about income inequality, and they say, that's right. You don't have to show me any evidence because I know in my bones that that's what's happening to our country, that the consequences of growing gaps between the rich and the poor is having an effect on the attitudes of people in our country. And so from my point of view, it is very clear, one, that income inequality has increased, where we, back in the early 80s, we were one of the most equal countries, most egalitarian countries in the developed world. And we now have significantly higher levels of inequality than many other countries. Second point is the causal relationship. That is, this income inequality does produce a significant effect in increasing social ills. We all know the story that, well, maybe I'm a bit older than many of you, but I can remember as a kid going out from the home, the doors were never locked. The windows were never barred or made highly secure. You wouldn't imagine doing that today, would you? I can also remember when one murder a year was the norm. One a week now? I don't think there's any doubt about what I've just told you. So what are the answers? Well, if you want to reduce inequality, obviously you've got to do something. And by the way, wealth inequality is actually worse than income inequality. If you want to do something about it, it's pretty obvious. One, you've got to control the incomes at the top. And I believe the answer is a much more steeply progressive tax system. I can remember when I first got into senior management that my top tax rate, my marginal tax rate, was 64 cents in the dollar. And even if you take off the 15% for GST, that brings you only back to around 50%. What's the top tax rate in New Zealand right now? So I believe that one of the answers is to go back to a steeply progressive income tax system. And many of the economists, even though it's an art form and not a science, many of the economists maintain that in fact there's no relationship between high pay and high performance. And secondly, they say that you do not increase tax avoidance until you get to tax rates of around 70 or 80%. So a much more steeply progressive tax system is one of the answers. Secondly, a wealth tax. I don't think there's any serious commentator that I read these days who doesn't say we need to go back to a capital gains tax. Okay, those are the incomes at the top. The incomes at the bottom, of course. The number of times you even hear right-wing politicians talking about the fact that we have a low-wage economy. What are we going to do about it? They seem to accept that that's the state that we should exist in, a low-wage economy. We've got to do something seriously about lifting the wages of those at the bottom. And the living wage, of course, is one of those answers. We need to make sure that nobody is on less than, I can think the current rate for the living wage is around $20 an hour. Now, I know there are many industries that would say, we can't afford that. Sure, and that's why I don't believe government should mandate a living wage as the minimum wage. But I believe that the government and local government should set a pattern, should take a lead in adopting those things, and so try to encourage industries to become more efficient, become more economic, to be more productive, so that in fact they can afford to pay the living wage. And the last thing, of course, are the benefits. I think it's a disgrace, the level of benefits in this country. Closing the Gap tries to be apolitical. We don't belong to any political party because we believe that the answer is, in fact, try and persuade all the parties in New Zealand to this particular point of view. Because, in fact, if we do that, then we've got some chance that what's put in place will, in fact, stay there over a period of time. And so, as I say, Closing the Gap is not aligned to any particular party. But I've got to say, that the Green Party's recent announcement of a 20% increase in benefits is the right thing. We are really a punitive society. We believe that if we make it really tough for people at the bottom, that will encourage them to do better. The research says, no, that doesn't work. If you encourage people and do the right thing by people, that's what makes them perform better. I've obviously run out of time. Thank you for listening so intently.